Christmas Day 1991, the hammer and sickle flag that had become synonymous with communism would be lowered for the final time, marking the end of the Soviet Union. This was done after the resignation of its president, Mikhail Gorbachev, marked by protests. After 70 years, the experiment that was the Soviet Union was dissolved. And just like it ended, the Soviet Union began with the revolution, the 1917 Russian revolutions, a more severe conflict that resulted in a civil war lasting until 1923 between the Red and White armies. Centuries of disappointing rule by the Romanov monarchy had resulted in the rise of a communist political party known as the Bolsheviks, led by a certain Vladimir Lenin. By 1922, the Bolsheviks, now known as the Russian Communist Party, had consolidated power and won the Civil War, uniting the four different republics that would form the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics in a one-party rule. Upon the death of Lenin, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin, became ruler of the Soviet Union in 1924. Stalin would remain as the head of the totalitarian state until his death in 1953. Through ineffective economic policies, famines would occur, resulting in the death of millions through the 1930s. Stalin's Great Purge also led to the imprisonment or execution of anyone suspected of being an opponent. Through the 5-year plans, Stalin would also attempt to industrialize the Soviet Union. The death of Stalin would lead to a political struggle that resulted in Nikita Khrushchev becoming head of the Soviet Union. In a secret speech given in February 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev shocked the party members when he denounced Stalin and his terror, laying blame for the political repressions on him alone. He would usher in a series of political reforms known as de-Stalinization. This involved the release of political prisoners from gulags and increased cooperation with the West. And while the Soviet Union was not completely liberalized, censorship was relaxed, leading to the publication of works such as the Gulag Archipelago, a memoir of life in the Soviet labor camps by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Khrushchev's time in office would see the establishment of the Warsaw Pact in 1955, the building of the Berlin Wall, and despite an initial thaw in the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which would bring the world close to a nuclear war. These relaxations in the cultural and political spheres would not last long, and by October 1964, as a result of the missile crisis, Khrushchev was removed from power, leading to a rollback of many of his reforms. Successive leaders, including Brezhnev, would take on a more totalitarian approach to rule, and at first were successful in growing the economy. But despite continued industrialization, the agricultural sector was not producing enough to feed its citizens. In the nuclear arms race, a number of treaties were signed under Brezhnev to limit nuclear missile counts. By 1982, growth had stalled, in part due to the oil crisis of the 1970s and Soviet intervention in neighboring Afghanistan. In 1985, a new leader would be elected following the deaths of his predecessors. Coming into power on the platforms of Perestroika and Glasnost, Gorbachev would take a less of a serious stance against the US, who were initially uncertain about him. Perestroika was a political reform movement which aimed for restructuring, and Glasnost hoped to get some transparency out of the government. It was on a visit to West Berlin that US President Ronald Reagan would make his now famous request, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," of course referring to the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev's reforms had the unintended consequence of proliferating nationalist independence movements within the Soviet Union and the iconic fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Between 1989 and 1991, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania would be the first to seek independence, declaring sovereignty and issuing condemnation of the Soviet military occupation in their territories. While violence was used by the Politburo to suppress revolts, many were peaceful, especially in Estonia and Latvia. Yet Moscow would take a violent and sometimes fatal approach in quelling protest. This was particularly notable in Lithuania, where on multiple occasions Soviet troops would fire on crowds in response to civil disobedience. After the Communist Party ended the one-party system, you could say the floodgates were opened. The government was now open to political opposition. By 1991, Boris Yeltsin, a proponent of free market economics and democracy, would be elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, receiving 54% of the vote. But despite the attempts at democratization, social unrest would continue. Things would take an even more dramatic shape in August 1991, when a coup against Gorbachev was attempted by officials of the Communist Party, including his own vice president. Although the coup was unsuccessful, it proved to be the beginning of the end for Gorbachev, who found his leadership in a vulnerable position. Boris Yeltsin, who had helped Gorbachev survive the coup, was now the key figure in the Kremlin, transferring power to himself and undermining Gorbachev, whose lackluster attempts at reform had proved to be unsuccessful amongst the public. The coup was another surprising turn in a chaotic sequence of events to those in the West, who had signed arms reduction agreements with the Soviet Union under the presidency of Gorbachev. A few days after the coup, Belarus and Ukraine declared independence. Other Soviet states would declare their own independence shortly after. With the economic and political challenges faced around the USSR, Gorbachev was unable to prevent the breakaway of the republics. Fast forward a few months. On the 25th of December 1991, Gorbachev resigned from his position as president of the Soviet Union and signed the documents declaring the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But at this point, this was a mere formality, given that the individual countries within the Soviet Union had declared independence. In place of the hammer and sickle flag, the tricolour Russian flag was raised. Boris Yeltsin would remain president until his resignation in 1999, after which he was succeeded by a former KGB officer by the name Vladimir Putin. Putin had served in East Germany, eventually leaving in the aftermath of the reunification. He is noted to have said that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. 30 years after the dramatic end of the Soviet Union, Putin would once again embark on another conflict following those in Crimea and Georgia in his quest for Russian expansion and opposition to NATO expansion. The end of the Soviet Union came after decades of poverty and economic stagnation. Poor leadership would also serve as a catalyst for its dissolution. Whilst many of the 15 ex-Soviet states have made strides, with some joining Western institutions such as the EU and NATO, the future hangs in balance as we await the outcome of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.